you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Henry Pearson. I work here in the OECD's Directorate for Education and Skills. And we're here today to ask ourselves a possibly difficult question, but an important one. Can and should education be totally rethought to better match the needs of the 21st century? You know, difficult as it was, the pandemic did show that some forms of education can work without a classroom, without being physically there, not in all cases, of course. And I think it also opened up a few eyes about the role of technology in education. You know, as technology gets better and better, so too do its applications for teaching and learning. So in this webinar, we're going to have a look at what could be changed now in the classroom, as well as what schools might look like in the future. It's a broad, pretty lofty topic, but perhaps this is our chance to shelve our skepticism for just 1 hour and allow ourselves to think big. Think about the physical arrangement of a school. You know, do we need a school building? Think about how assessment is carried out. Could we use artificial intelligence to help that process? And think about the role of teachers. You know, should it be changed? Could it be completely different? Is it outdated? So these are the kind of things we're going to try and think about in this webinar. It's all about keeping our minds open and really imagining what the future of education could be. And to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Andreas Schleicher, OECD Director for Education and Skills. And alongside Andreas, we have three wonderful teachers from three very different parts of the world. From Finland, we have Pirjo Suonen, who is teacher and founder of ALO Finland, which is a platform that offers massive open online courses on Finnish education. From the United States, we have Doug Lemov, teacher and author of Teach Like a Champion, which looks at examples of outstanding teaching practice collected from real classrooms. And finally, from Mexico, we have Elisa Guerra, who is a teacher and also a member of UNESCO's International Commission on the Futures of Education. So first, Andreas is going to present a collection of OECD work to kind of frame the discussion. And then after that, we'll dive into the conversation with our panelists. So if you have a question for any of our panelists at any time, please put it in the chat or on in the comments on Facebook if you're watching on Facebook, and we will read out as many as we can later on in the webinar. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Andreas.
Thank you so much, Henry. And I know we're going to talk about things from the classroom up, but you know, sometimes it helps to take a bit of a distance and look at education from the outside. And you know, that's what the OECD is really, really good at. So I'm going to share some ideas with you. Obviously, you know, this is a moment where our eyes are still very much focused on the pandemic and the way in which it's disrupted conventional ways of doing an education. But one thing is certain, the future is always going to surprise us. Climate change is going to disrupt our lives a lot more than this pandemic. And artificial intelligence, you know, puts our thinking about education really to the test. We know how to educate second-class robots. You know, people are very good at repeating what we told them, but what will make us human in a world where the kind of things that are easy to teach and test have also become easy to digitize, to automate? I think this question really, really is at the heart of the discussion today. And then, you know, you have lots of other forces shaping the world around us and clearly having an impact on education. Let me pick up a few of these. You know, if you look at how our economies are developing these days, you can see where you see, you know, rises and growth. It's all about ideas, the intangibles. It's the intangible economy, basically great tech companies that are, you know, spreading, sharing knowledge. The traditional industries that produce stuff are also still existing, but they're pretty much, you know, where they were decades ago. So the Fortune 500s 2 decades ago are no longer the drivers of our societies. Now, this is all about intangibles, and intangibles is all about knowledge and skills. And that means basically, you know, those who have the right knowledge and skills and attitudes and values never had the life chances they find today. But those who struggle in that transition have a harder and harder time. Our labor markets are becoming much less forgiving for the lack of skills. And if I talk about the labor markets, you can make even a strong argument about our societies, the economic, the social, the cultural polarization that we see all around us has all to do with the distribution of knowledge and skills. If you do not understand the world around you, cannot interact, engage with people who are different from you, who think differently, if you cannot see the world through different lenses of and perspectives, you're pretty much on your own. And once again, the drivers are not so difficult to understand. We see a disappearance of routine tasks. In the 1970s and 80s, robots took over whole factories, and now artificial intelligence challenges this kind of structured ways of thinking that we focus on in education. We've seen an increase in technology intensive tasks. You put the two things together, that's the future of work. And you can see some of that already playing out in the reality. Here's some interesting analysis. On the vertical axis, you see the skill level in populations. Now, the higher up you are as a country, the more, greater the talent pool in your country in terms of skills that we can measure. On the horizontal axis, you see the risk of losing jobs to robots, risk of automation. And you can see the two things are pretty closely linked. Economies that build their future on education are much better protected from the forces of automation than economies that have a poor talent pool. Now, that's the future of work, the future of our economies. If we ask 15-year-olds, and we did that in PISA, what do you want to do in your life? Actually, you can see that 30, 40, sometimes over 50% of those young people aspire to jobs that are actually at the highest risk of automation. What this tells us is that we are educating people for our past, not their future. Now, we are not giving young people a sense of where the world is going or what the kind of work, the kind of tasks that will gain in importance. We have to do a better job of giving young people a more realistic appreciation of their future, to have them dream about jobs. Today's education is not, preparing people for jobs. It's about helping them to create jobs, to develop tomorrow's society, economy. Last but not least, knowledge is always power. If you think about, 20 years ago, we had a few television anchors, a few newspaper editors who, produce the information we all consumed. We're dependent on a very few people. Today, we are all our own journalists. We all contribute to that knowledge. You can see that here, the number of pages in wikis, how it's risen exponentially. It's also created entirely new challenges. In the past, when you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia and you could trust that answer to be true. Today, you look up things on Google and nobody is going to tell you what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. But contrast this with the capabilities of young people. Now, we looked at the capacity of 15-year-olds in our last PISA assessment. Can you distinguish fact from opinion? Can you manage complexity? Can you navigate ambiguity? And you can see on the left side, there are few education systems, mainly in Asia, where students are quite good at that, good at navigating the digital world, good at distinguish fact from opinion. And in most countries, actually, young people struggle with this. People born into the digital world are not automatically digital natives. And this has actually very little to do with technology. It's the kind of human skills to actually navigate knowledge, to construct knowledge that are missing. One last aspect. In our most recent assessment, we looked at creative skills of young people. And one of the most disturbing findings is that, 15-year-olds report to be less creative than 10-year-olds. Now, if I would tell you, 15-year-olds do worse in mathematics than 10-year-olds, you would tell me, well, we're doing something wrong in schooling. But we never ask ourselves a question when it comes to creativity, because it's sort of beyond our radar screen. We don't see it. We don't talk about it. We think, that's more like a personality attribute than something like a skill. Well, but children are born with an abundance of creativity. If you have a 3-year-old son or daughter, they're going to question everything you tell them. They're going to experiment with anything that gets into their way. They're always willing to learn, always willing to unlearn, always willing to relearn when the context changes. And then, we get them into school, we make them compliant with our ways of thinking, and I'm a scientist by background. When I see in school, sometimes we teach science more like religion. We make people believe in some scientific paradigms and we make them practice it, rehearse it, and then reproduce what we expect from them. But actually that has very little to do with the ways of thinking of a scientist. And then, we shouldn't be surprised at seeing those kinds of data. And last but not least, of course, there is the environment. What you can see very clearly that, we live well if there would be 1.7 planets. And if you are an American, you consume as if there would be 5 planets. So this is clearly unsustainable. And education in the future, really balancing act, helping people become more resilient to live in this structurally imbalanced world. And at the same time, keep the world in balance, making things more sustainable. And we shouldn't underestimate the power of education to do that. We can, education is shaping political commitments. It has a huge impact on local communities, who you live with, how you live with people. And, as a consumer, the personal choices you make, the employment you choose, the way you invest your resources, that has a bigger influence as well. And then, of course, what we do always influences others. So that's the theory. So in our last PISA assessment, we asked school leaders, to what extent, do you deal with those mega trends, these global topics? And the answer was virtually all school principals said, yeah, we're doing this. 9 out of 10 school principals say, yeah, climate change and global warming is embedded in the curriculum, or gender equality, conflicts, poverty, migration. All those themes seem to be actually quite popular in most education systems. But when we ask students, it's a slightly different picture. You can see here, almost 8 out of 10 students say, yeah, looking after the global environment is important to me. The climate agenda has become urgent, important to young people. But when you ask them, can you make a difference to this? Or do you think what you do has an impact on people in other places? You can see the bars get a lot shorter. And that's a really powerful message. And you can see, some of the education systems, look, Singapore and Korea are leading the world when it comes to climate knowledge. You have virtually, 8 out of 10 students say, yeah, I can explain how carbon dioxide emissions affect global climate change. That knowledge is there. But when you survey them, what does it mean for your own practices? Those countries are not at the frontier. Now, Korea is pretty much at the bottom of the pile, which tells us really knowledge doesn't translate into behavior. What we lack is the capacity of young people to mobilize their cognitive, social, emotional resources. And learning is often about passive consumption, not about active construction. You can see that in this data. You can see that, by the way, most people. On the vertical axis, you see the success of students on this global PISA test, the way actually education system outcomes are. On the horizontal axis, you can see an outcome of their growth mindset. And, countries like Estonia, who are doing really well academically, are also ones where that growth mindset is very well developed. Whereas, a country like Indonesia struggles academically, and students often believe, well, success is about the intelligence I was born with. And it's not just about, PISA outcomes. Students with a growth mindset were more motivated to master difficult tasks. They had a greater sense of self-efficacy. They were less afraid of failure. They saw greater value in school. These are the kind of, findings we should, start to get our hands around. So how does the future like? One temptation is, of course, is, we think about our favorite future, or we think about the future that is most likely and put all our hopes in this. But that is often, as we have seen, a bad recipe. What we should do is to become much more agile, much more open to alternative versions of the future. And the more futures we can imagine, the more we become better to, think those futures through, what they could mean for learners, for teachers, for schools, for nations, the better we will be prepared for the future that eventually arrives. Let's think about it. One future, things will pretty much remain as they are. The systems will just, organically grow. And Some people say, after the pandemic, that's impossible. Everything is going to be totally different. Well, I'm not so sure, actually. Education systems have been remarkably resilient to change. They always bounce back to where they came from. Education is an incredibly conservative social enterprise. And sometimes, we as parents are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. We get very anxious when our children no longer learn what was important for us, or when they start to learn things that actually we no longer understand. So let's not underestimate these forces that push us back to, where we come from. One answer is, you can see that where another scenario is, maybe digitalization will take over. One day these very, traditional heavy structures will break down. Artificial intelligence has become so great that, parents are going to look for alternative solutions. We're going to see this unbundling of educational content, delivery, and accreditation. And you're going to see a much more colorful market of solutions now. But again, what the pandemic has really taught us as well is that education is not about the transaction of knowledge. It's always a social, a relational enterprise. Now, the biggest influence during the pandemic on student success had nothing to do with what was happening. It had to do with that students found that teacher who, helped them understand who they are and who they want to become, who kept that personal relationship. So maybe the third scenario, maybe, schools will move into the opposite direction, less transaction, more about, becoming a kind of learning hub that brings together different stakeholders from our societies. And that brings me to sort of one aspect that has to do not so much with academic outcomes, but with student well-being. When we ask 10-year-olds about their well-being, generally, we got a very positive picture. You can see here, most 10-year-olds say, my daily life is filled with things that interesting me. I woke up feeling fresh and rested. I felt cheerful and in good spirits. You ask those questions to 15-year-olds and the bars get a lot shorter. Yeah, developmental psychologists have lots of explanations for this. Maybe as students get older, they become more kind of, they go through a difficult development phase and so on. But even if that is all of the explanation, or most of it, shouldn't be better aware of it. And when we studied that in different cities around the world, we've actually found some really interesting answers to these questions. When we asked, what drives that, sense of positive well-being, it had a lot to do with the stress resistance of students, a sense of optimism, growing out with this growth mindset, with this sense of optimism and their energy they felt. That's really what we found to be very, very robust predictors of student well-being. And that calls, for that social hub scenario of schooling. And now, of course, and that's where we get, building the classroom from the bottom up. You ask yourself, okay, what drives that stress resistance? What drives that optimism? What drives that energy? And, and the answer is actually much simpler than you would imagine. It's all to do with the quality of teacher-student relationships, where teachers had that close relationship with students. In the eyes of students were more stress resistant. They were more optimistic. They had greater control over their own emotions. And by the way, that was true also about almost any other social emotional skill that we measured, whether it's responsibility, persistence, whether it was empathy, trust, cooperation, tolerance, curiosity, creativity. Again, if we think about the future of education, we need to think about the what. What should we be learning? We should think about the social relationships, the spaces, the people, the technologies, the environments, how we support teachers in this environment. Big questions to answer. I hope this webinar will get us further. And it's often, about, balancing and managing tensions and dilemmas. Now, how do we strike that right balance between modernizing education and capitalizing on disruptions like this pandemic? Now, how do we reconcile new goals of education with our current structures that we won't change quickly? How do we help people to become globally minded while remaining rooted in their local traditions and cultures? People who are not having a floor under their feet are very likely to going to build walls around them. How do we foster a culture of innovation in an environment that is so risk averse? How do we realize potential in the reality? How do we reconcile the virtual world and the face-to-face world in education? And perhaps also how we find a better balance between learning and education. I know we have a great panel, and I'm sure we'll find good answers to this today. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Andreas. A lot to take in, a lot of food for thought for the discussion, but let's dive into it. And actually, my first question is going to go to Doug, and I'm afraid it's going to be a big one. So brace yourself. You have the unlucky duty of taking on the first one. So schools run in more or less the same way as they have done for quite some time, right? A society, on the other hand, is shifting all the time. So what, if anything, is the most important or urgent change we need to help schools kind of match the shift in society, in your opinion?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And thank you for asking me to join this panel. I'm really excited to be with you all today. And I hope that my answer doesn't disappoint you, and I fear that it will. There are two things I think I'd like to say at the beginning. One is that it's overwhelmingly true that technology and associated social changes in social structure as a result of technology have brought immense benefit and power to people in society. But it also comes at immense costs. And because the benefits are so large, it is easy to overlook the costs. And they have not been, I don't think, examined fully in their costs and what they mean for young people. And so I think what I would argue is, yes, of course, schools should change, and preparing young people for a changing world is something we should constantly be reflecting on. But it doesn't mean that the changes that happen in schools necessarily reflect that world entirely. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of what I mean. Going back to Andres' slide about the change in mindset and worldview between 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds. This data is replicated in the United States. And if anyone's interested in diving deep into this, Jean Twenge's book, iGen, is a deep study of teenagers' responses to broad questions about their lives over time. So she's been studying this data for 30 years. And what she finds is that I think she would explain the difference between 10 and 15-year-olds as being students get iPhones, they get smartphones between the ages of 10 and 15. And the result of that is a disconnection from the world around them and an immersion in the electronic world. And social media and smartphones are devastating for young people psychosocially. They increase, she would describe, I think, epidemic levels of isolation, anxiety, depression, and disconnection. So there's a lot that technology can do for us, but I would say that one of the things I would be thinking, I say this as a father as much as an educator, is, schools are one of the last places where we can provide students with a place where they are off their cell phones and where they connect with other people face to face and build the social and relational skills that allow them to be successful and work together with people and learn to listen. And I think that that's profoundly important. Even if you're not on your phone, when you're a young person now, you walk up to a group of your friends and they're on their phone and they're looking down and there's no eye contact and there's no smile of greeting. And I think that, I just think it's important for us to be, as we consider the changes that technology is bringing to society, one of the things that schools can do is make students feel connected. I agree that relationships are I think oftentimes when students talk about the relationship with a teacher, what they're describing is the way that the community that the teacher builds in a classroom together with people in the same room makes them feel. And so I think there's immense potential to distance learning, but there's also a cost to that. And I think that shows up in the data, at least in this country, what happened during the pandemic. I think one of the other results of technology that we should be aware of is the fracturing and of attention. One of the things that happens when you're constantly online is you're constantly, in the workplace in particular, we're constantly reactive to our thoughts being disrupted and interrupted by push messages and emails from someone else that we have to respond to. And I think that one of the things you need to do knowledge work, and I think one of the data that Andreas is pointing out is describing a push toward, towards what we would call knowledge work. And that's the most enduring work and the most important work. What do you need to be successful at that work? You need to be able to sustain states of attention and focus and concentration for long periods of time to do unique work that differentiates you from other people and that is not replicable by technology. And those states, I think, are harder and harder to create. I would just describe to you the decline of reading behaviors among young people. Young people read for pleasure about 1/5 as much as they did 15, 20 years ago. And I think that this is a profoundly important change. And then, the NCTE, the National Council of Teachers of English in this country, recently came out with a bold statement that said we should decenter our classes, decenter the book from our classes. And I think that is a fundamental. The more we change, I think the more it's important to stay in touch with the history of thinking, which is captured in books. But I look at my own son reading, and when he reads, he's lying on his back with his cell phone on his chest. And as he's discovering why the caged bird sings, which is I know why the caged bird sings, this is one of the most taught novels in American schools. He's constantly interrupted by thoughts about what's up with the Kardashians, and hey dude, we're over at Pedro's, come on over now, right? And so I think it's important for schools to think about what it takes to be successful in a technological world is not necessarily what we should replicate in our schools and our classrooms. And we still need to be attentive to building spaces of where deep attention and the ability to focus and sustain thinking about a rigorous topic for a long period of time, and do that socially and in connection with other people and listen carefully to them. Those things remain really important. So for me, one of the takeaways from the pandemic is how urgently students need to be back together in the room with other people, and how it's very difficult. You can replicate the transmission of information easily through Zoom, but it feels very different from being in the room with other, I think we're a very social species. When we think about the history of evolution, we think about ourselves triumphing as individuals. Like we had big brains and opposable thumbs, and we stood upright on the savannah, and therefore we triumphed in the struggle of evolution. But in fact, a human being by themselves with a big brain and an opposable thumb through most of evolution was something else's lunch, unless that human being could coordinate with other people and cooperate and rely on each other. And we therefore evolved to put immense priority on our ability to connect socially and what it means to feel like part of the group. And so I think as we make these changes, I think it's really important to keep track of these things, because is there the potential for technology to revolutionize, teaching labor markets? Absolutely. Is there a possibility for schools that struggle to find world-class physics teachers and to gain access to expertise? Absolutely. But I think we also should not make the assumption that the changes in schools necessarily need to mirror the changes in society. In many cases, they should be antidotes to some of the changes in society to prepare students to be able to be prepared for both the downsides and the benefits of technology. And I apologize, I know that's a little bit of a different take on it. I think both things can be true. We can build critical thinkers and global thinkers, and also retain a connection to the things that have connected students to school and learning in the past.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the technologies you talked about there, I mean, you made some great points, especially about social media and the possibility of it being damaging. Is Pirio, are you waving to jump in?
Yes, I'm waving. Sorry,
I didn't want to. Point, but go for it.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt you, so I thought that I wave instead. Hey, thank you, Doug. That was beautiful. I totally agree with you. I don't wish to see kids on screens only either. And I think after pandemic, we all crave for human connection. However, I still like technology also, but indeed, it is a true point. We need to find the ways to have a bit of both, because I think there was a interesting, I think it was an OECD research where they researched children's skills, how techie savvy they actually are, and it's really quite narrow, quite worryingly narrow actually. So in that sense, I still argue that we need to have some technology in there, but not so much. I still love books. I still love chalkboard. They create tools, but when I think it's more about integration of technology rather than just dumping lots of devices and apps in there. I still believe that Teacher is the best app out there and always will be. And but let me just give you an example. When I was teaching kids the coding skills, app was only a small part of it, and the games. And same with the mathematics games I used. But I wanted to use the games to support the interaction between the learners and also the teachers. And I used chalkboard in the coding lessons. So old tools and modern tools, they can work beautifully hand in hand. And I think they still should. So hopefully I made a point.
No, it's a great point. And I will go to Elisa because I had a question for Elisa after that. But Andreas, what I was going to say, and actually Peter, you already touched on it, was some of the technologies that Doug mentioned are about social media, right? They're about use of smartphones. But there's a plethora of other things that can be used in the organization of a school or in how a classroom runs, technologies that could be useful for that process. Andreas, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that. I know the OECD has had a look at the different kinds of technologies that are emerging for classrooms.
Yeah, absolutely. But actually, I must say, I agree very much with Doug here that school is really unique through the social space that it provides. And education is not a transactional business, it's always a social relation experience. But absolutely, technology can, accelerate that and can amplify it. Technology can, we know from our own research how technology can make learning so much more adaptive, so much more granular, so much more interactive. Now, why would you listen to someone explaining you the results of an experiment when you can do that experiment in a virtual laboratory? If you look at learning analytics, teachers can get a much better sense how different students learn differently and then engage with them in ways that was much harder in a large classroom. So I do think there's a lot of potential, but and that comes back to the point that Doug made. I do believe that the best technology is the one that is present but invisible. It is not distracting students from the learning experience. It's helping teachers to see how different students learn differently, helping students to get their more immediate, more direct feedback, or adaptive learning. Students with special needs are not generally well served in our schools, and there what you can do for students with autism or with physical difficulties is just amazing through technology. But again, I think we should think of technology as something that can amplify, accelerate great teaching rather than replace poor teaching.
Yeah, and the thing as well is, obviously technology is a big driver of change in the 21st century, but there are also societal shifts, right? There's just all sorts of different changes going on that are affecting how society runs. And it again brings me back to something that Doug was talking about you described how your son reads, he reads like that with his phone here. It reminds me that the students themselves are also different. There's a risk to treat students exactly the same as they were treated 30, 40 years ago, but they themselves are not quite the same. They don't have the same experience as we did. So I'm wondering if Elisa, if you could comment on whether the needs of students have changed. And this is exactly the moment some drilling is going on. Anyway, Elisa, go ahead. The needs of the student.
Thank you, Henry. Well, just to comment a little bit on this technology in education dilemma that we have been listening to. I would just like to add a tiny little point. In the report from UNESCO on the futures of education, we see schools as becoming part of a larger learning ecosystem, which is comprised by a trilogy of spaces. And these spaces are built spaces such as schools and libraries and community centers and others as such. And also the digital spaces. And finally, and very importantly as well, natural spaces. So I like to think that if we can be part of this ecosystem with these three spaces, we can provide a much richer experience for our students. But now, student needs. I'm not sure, Henry, I will say that students' needs have changed that much, but I will definitely say that there are many needs that still go unfulfilled. And while I was not a teacher 30 years ago, I was a student a little bit longer than 30 years ago, to be honest. But when I was in school as a learner, I remember at least two things that I believed. One is that I was convinced that my teachers knew everything. They just knew everything there was to be done. They were super wise, and that was awesome. And the second thing that I remember while I was learning about history and science is that I got this feeling, this queasy feeling that everything was already invented or discovered, like if knowledge was already done. And I was happy on a sense that I got to live in an area that was safer on one hand, but it was also a time that was absolutely boring on the other hand, because somebody, usually a man, by the way, somebody in the past had already done the important things that needed to be done. And it was kind of sad that I was convinced that I will never get the chance to invent something or discover something. And I was very young then, of course, and with time I saw that I was wrong. But it's interesting for me to think how I got that impression in the first time, the impression that knowledge was done. And that the only thing that I could do with it, with knowledge, was to acquire it. And my suspicion is that it came from how we were taught and how we still teach. Sometimes we present history or science or math or whatever as a set of facts that are set in stone, that are not open to discussion. This is the way it is. This is the way things work. Because the teacher says so, or because the textbook says so, or because the principal says so. And I believe that we are doing better in these days in not only allowing, but in fact, encouraging students to engage different with the content, thinking about it, analyzing, and even questioning the ideas. But I believe that we still have some work to do, some way to go in becoming co-creators of knowledge, teachers and students. Knowledge is never done. We will spend our lifetimes witnessing the expansion of knowledge and hopefully taking an active part of it. One of the greatest joys of life comes from creating something. And that's why I got very sad when I saw that slide from Andreas on how kids, their creativity, they are less creative, or they see themselves as less creative at 15 compared to when they were 10. Every child deserves to know that creativity is part of their human inheritance. So I think that's still a debt that we need to address.
Yeah, actually, that slide from Andreas about 15-year-olds expressing lower creativity than 10-year-olds has caused a stir in the chat as well. There's a lot of people commenting on it, a few questions about it. But I know, Pirjo, that in Finland, creativity is an important part of the education process. Not the same in other countries, but in Finland it is. Can you tell us a little bit about how that works and why it's so important for Finnish education?
Thank you. And firstly, may I just comment a few things about Elisa's comment, because you tickled my brain beautifully. That what I was thinking, that I always like to say that life is learning and school should be for life, not just tests. Tests are important in that sense that they offer us valuable comparison data. I mean, we wouldn't know that Finland or Estonia were doing good if we didn't have PISA, for instance. But and also what I was thinking, what Elisa was saying, that I always like to think that if schools could create more innovators, then our future is safe. And I always say when I give teacher training elsewhere that don't offer anything for children on a silver plate. Like Elisa was saying, that she thought that knowledge is already there and that's it. It's done. You don't need to work on it anymore. You just need to learn it. But if you don't offer it on a silver plate, make them work for it, then you're not only creating creative thinkers, but also independent and critical thinkers and problem solvers. And I think that is one of the key issues, not just creativity. But to go back to Henry's question, why is it important and how it's done? I mean, in Finland, we don't start formal education before the age 7, and it's a lot of it is play-based learning also. I mean, we still teach the basics of academics. And I, for instance, I work in Montessori school and I love the learning environment, etc. But there's still a lot of play involved. And Lego, for instance, they've done a lot of beautiful research on the power of play, how it doesn't only increase and amplify creativity, but many other competencies also. I mean, collaboration and imagination skills. If there isn't imagination, there won't be creativity either. And also because we don't have standardized tests like, for instance, in UK or US, and which tend to narrow down learning a little bit. So, I mean, if teachers are penalized for not getting great test results, then it tends to narrow down the teaching and learning in classrooms. You tend to aim for the good test results rather than maybe aiming for competencies which are a bit harder to measure. So short and sweet. Did I answer your question, or I'm thinking whether I left out something?
No, you did answer it. I'm just thinking about just lingering on creativity a little bit, because actually in the chat, there was a question from Chris saying, if creativity and well-being decline between ages 10 and 15, according to the OECD study, what is it that schools can do to stop that or limit that decline? So I don't know whether anyone wants to jump in on that. Elisa.
I don't know if this is an answer, maybe it's just more food for thought, but have you noticed some differences between 6-year-olds and 15-year-olds? 6-year-olds, first day of school, they all sit in the front of the classroom. You ask the question as the teacher, everybody has their hand up. They don't even know what the question is already, but they are willing to try. They say, me, pick me, pick me, pick me. Fast forward, they are 15, first day of school. They all sit in the back of the classroom. If the teacher says, I have a question, they just lunge and go like this, or they look the other way. So they won't pick me, I want to be picked. What happened in these years? What happened? What did we do to them to create this? And what we cannot, how can we avoid doing that? So I don't know, maybe it was just a little bit of frustration coming out. But I think that this is something that we need to consider. And I think it's related to creativity as well.
I think Doug was first. I saw a hand up from Doug.
I was actually just going to reference Pirjo and say, I think it goes back to what Pirjo said about the teacher is the most important educational app that technology allows us to provide students with beautiful and powerful nuggets of information that can spark their curiosity. If it's, I think, ideally mediated by a teacher, in other words, the teacher selects it and curates it and then drops it into a pond. And the pond is this creative environment, a hothouse that she has created that creates, that makes the kind of creativity, Elisa, that you're talking about among sixth graders. That I can show you video of classrooms where that mindset still exists among 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds, where everyone's hand is in the air and students are eager. You know, I believe that teachers can create that when they're attentive. I think what drives it, we're all incredibly attentive to the social norms. Peps McRae, in his beautiful book, Motivated Teaching, just cites all this research on how the single biggest motivator on the single biggest influence on human motivation and behavior is peer norms and our expectation of peer norms. And so if I build a community where people perceive it to be normal and positive to raise your hand and be curious and be thirsty for knowledge, that that we can sustain that kind of curiosity. And I do think that's sort of maybe what I was getting. That's the place where I think the teacher remains irreplaceable, because the teacher shapes the social norms and guides the social norms of the room where a group of young people learn. I'm sorry to yam on. I was meaning to pass it to you quickly, Pirjo. I apologize, but building off what you said.
Beautiful, thank you. Is it my turn now, Henry? Thank you. Hey, I'm also a big fan of Ken Robinson, and I mean, I loved his work. And he always talked about that if the school could be the place where everyone could find their own passion and the element, and I think that would be the key to find the creativity part also, because for me creativity means not just art and music, like everyone knows, creativity, maths and science, you name it, robotics, everything. And if you truly find your passion and you know what you're good at, what is your strength, I think you find the creativity within you also. So in other words, creativity for me means multiple intelligences. And to go back to the previous question, what someone asked in the chat, that how can we support this already at school? If we have a little bit less standardized tests, which may narrow the learning, we open doors for more multiple intelligences, I believe. Then it allows that best app out there to really figure out what they have in their classrooms and schools and try to support them as well as they can.
Yeah, I think Pirjo makes an important point here that, developing creativity has a lot less to do with the subject and more to do with the learning environment. In fact, we have no evidence suggesting that the arts is necessarily the better way to educate creativity than, mathematics. It's really about the learning environment. And I don't think it's so difficult. You can see plenty of great examples, maker spaces. It's basically creating, rather than filling things up in school, is about creating spaces where students, can find out, what their passions are, where they can find out where they can become really, really good at. And again, that brings me to Doug's point. I think, yes, that's what teachers can do. That's not always what teachers do. There's a lot of knowledge transmission actually happening in school. And, this teacher becoming, more of a mentor, more of a coach, more of a kind of, social worker, support of students. And that is actually, I think, really at the heart of this, creating space for creativity. And it happens, if you actually give young people the tools, the spaces, amazing things happen. We see this all over the world in many kind of educational programs. So it's not really hard. It's just, escapes, it's our industrial approach to education, where basically we have tailorized work organization, where we have made teachers exchangeable figures teaching a specific subject to a specific grade, rather than, seeing, how different students evolve differently. And I think we have tried to make education more efficient by saying, okay, we have to employ not just teachers, but also social workers and psychologists, and everybody focus on their specialization. Whereas, education really requires people, and that quality of those relationships is really what ultimately drives that space in which students, take risk. If you want young people to be creative, you have to give them space to experiment. If they experiment, they will have to take risk. If they take risk, they will make mistakes. If you help, young people learn from and with mistakes, you're going to see creativity emerging. The good thing is that creativity is not something that we have to build. It's actually inborn in us. We just have to, again, allow room for expression.
So again, there's more drilling, but Andreas, we've talked a lot about creativity, and all the panelists have, but that's just one of a few kind of social emotional skills. And it's kind of seeming like maybe social emotional skills is part of 21st century education. And I'm wondering, Andreas, do you agree? Do you think that there's a bigger role for those kind of skill sets?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think we should see social emotional skills at the opposing end of the spectrum of, academic learning or content knowledge. I do think we should see them as two sides of the same coin. In a way, I think it is the combination that really makes people human. It's you want an engineer who is, an empathic engineer, a creative engineer. You want, and I do think that is what is and yet the first day you leave school, you do your first job interview, people will figure that out. Can you deal with people who are different from you? Can you live with yourself? Can you live with people who think differently from you? Can you live with the planet? Those are the questions you'll be confronted with, and we have often removed them from schools. It's so interesting, some of the things that are so important when it comes to social emotional skills, we call extracurricular activity. This is not part of the curriculum. It should be the core of the curriculum. And I do think we should, build that more, that two sides of the same coin, philosophy into every subject. It shouldn't just be the sports or the arts class. It should be every class that looks at learning in a much more holistic way. Attitudes, values play as much a role in success in life, at work, and employers, by the way, are the first to understand this. Actually, what is amazing is that education is a space that has the hardest time with that logic, that is still captured by very academic knowledge that trickles down from universities up to early childhood education. If you go to the world of work, employers, people in life, they actually are much further advanced in recognizing that these are not soft skills. That's another of those terms that actually is so destructive. These are the hard skills of the 21st century.
Some people in the chat are commenting on how it's kind of hard to convince the people at the very top of the education system of the value of those kind of skills. Elisa, I know you've worked with a few UNESCO programs. Do you have any experience, engaging with governments and convincing them of certain projects and needs for education?
Oh my God, no, not really. And, I don't want to sound pessimistic because we cannot afford to be pessimistic, not in the post-pandemic world. But I will rather think what we can do right now, right there, wherever you are in your classroom. At the same time, of course, try to push the elephant. Better if we try to do this together. But we can start a movement from the ground up. And the pandemic, if something, it showed that, almost no country was really responding to the pandemic in a great way, at least at the beginning, with few exceptions. But this created an opportunity for innovation. And I think that this window has not yet closed, but it's going to close eventually. So we need to act right now to, for example, what do we do with to recover the so-called learning loss? Of course, piling up more content at twice the speed, and it's not going to solve the problem. So we do have really tough problems to think about, and I will very much like to see all teachers put hands to the action. And maybe inspire other teachers to do the same. And maybe from the classroom up, we can bring about change.
So we're coming to the end of the webinar. I have one question, a kind of last roundup question that's pretty big. So again, brace yourselves. But I want you to imagine it's the year 2042. What does education look like now? Are schools different? Where's technology? What's the role of the teacher? And how are students engaging with their learning? So a little bit of a thought experiment. Maybe I can start with Doug.
Thanks. Possibly mildly ironic because I'm probably the most cautious in terms of advocating wholesale change. But I think what I imagine is certain things enduring. And certain things change. I think one of the areas that Pirjo pointed out that we could change quickly is assessment and how we understand what we understand about students' learning, so we don't narrow it. For example, and maybe just one other sort of form of knowledge and technology that I think is important to understand is the growth of our understanding of cognitive science. And we've learned more in the last 20 years about how people learn than we did in the previous 200 combined. And a lot of those findings are counterintuitive. And one of the things we know is how profoundly important background knowledge is to creativity and critical thinking and higher order thinking. And so, and the most important form of background knowledge is vocabulary. Vocabulary is incredibly hard to assess and measure. How do we know whether students are learning the words that they need to be able to describe their world? I often use this quotation by W.H. Auden that I love, which is, he says that language is is the mother, not the handmaiden of thought. That when you have a word for something, it creates your ability to conceive of it, as opposed to just describing something you already knew. And so I think there's the potential for us to use artificial intelligence and forms of technology to better understand vocabulary fluency, how to better understand student learning so that we can be less restrictive when we assess it. I think Pirjo did a great job of pointing out there are benefits it's important to understand where we're successful in assessment and what's working and understand our work. And there are also limitations in that it constrains us. So hopefully that's one area where we would make, where we continue to make immense changes. I think, you know, when I imagine schools in 2050, I think that I imagine still deeply connected personal spaces curated by a teacher, but increasingly infused by rich learning experiences that can assist in lighting students' minds on fire, right? I can imagine everyone puts their VR headsets on and we do the science experiment that we couldn't otherwise do. And then we take our headsets off and we talk about it in a deeply interpersonal environment where we listen to each other and attend to each other, and students bring out the best in each other. So I think I'm imagining a sort of both things are true kind of world where many of the things that we do now endure, and but we infuse it with carefully curated examples of technology. And I'm sure that that answer is underwhelming to many people on the call, but I think I'm you know, first I think it's important to move cautiously and not presume that everything is wrong with what we have now, at least the best versions of what we have now.
Pirjo, what are your thoughts? School in 2042.
I better unmute myself first. Thank you, Doug. Beautifully put. I think let teachers teach and be creative teachers also. And I'd love to see a school where AI meets EI, meaning artificial meets emotional intelligence. And also, I always felt that school is so much more than just a building. I'd like to see a modern building where you can easily transfer furniture and classroom things, and you can make it more like a global, not global, but local community also. And why not global learning also, with a little screen window to another school in Mexico. And but more so, I just scribbled when Doug was talking that I would love to see a school culture and atmosphere where both learners and teachers feel safe to fail and innovate. Because if you want to innovate, if you really want risk takers, both teachers and learners, you need to make them feel safe first. And I also like to say that happy teacher is a good teacher. Same goes with the happy learner.
Andreas, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, you know, that is one area where I'm quite optimistic, and that's actually the area that Doug mentioned. You know, I do believe one of the biggest mistakes in education that we made over the last centuries is to divorce learning from assessment. You know, we make people pile up lots and lots of knowledge, and then, you know, one day we call them back and, you know, tell me everything in a constrained, contrived setting. And I'm pretty confident 42, that's gone away. Like in the very long gone past, learning will be a lot more about apprenticeship. You learn with and from people. Technology is going to give you that immediate feedback over how you learn, what you learn, and so on. So I think that reintegration of learning and assessment, I'm pretty sure will happen even before then. Where I am hopeful, and but I do think we have to work hard, is to take a less instrumental view on education. You know, in the past we learned for something, for a specific job, and in the world in which we live, that logic no longer works. You know, we don't have to educate people for jobs that we know, but, you know, for jobs that have not been created, to imagine, you know, social situations that we are difficult to dealing with today. And I think that's really, I think, a very, very important transition that I hope we will be able to manage, moving also to make people better, help people make better trade-offs between the present and the future, to move from situational values, you know, I do whatever the current situation allows me to do, to more sustainable values. You know, I think about the future, the implications of what I do today, to also build, you know, a more lifelong perspective of learning. Maybe pile up less when you're young and continue more, and have better opportunities to expand your horizon, and hopefully also for learning in 42 become more of a whole of society enterprise. You know, again, it shouldn't be a kind of institution disconnected or separate from society. It should really be, I think, part of our social processes. So lots of hopes for 42. I do believe, you know, we have, unfortunately, over the last decades, seen a growing gap between what our societies require and what education provides. We should be cognizant of that, and I hope we will be able to close that gap.
Finally, Elisa.
Well, first of all, yes, there will still be schools and teachers in 2042, but I envision them as schools being really diverse. Today, as you were saying at the beginning, Henry, most schools are very similar, cookie cutter similar. Just a tiny few of them break the mold. And for tomorrow, I envision much more choices and much more ways to reach every student at every stage of life.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, big thank you to Andreas, Pirjo, Doug, and Elisa. I think we've now pretty much run out of time. It's just gone the hour. And this is the moment that the people decided to stop drilling above me. So if they had done that maybe 20 minutes ago, I would have been thankful. But oh well, we can't win them all. But yes, we'll have to bring this to a close. But big thank you to our panelists, and thank you to everybody for watching and for your interest in this topic. Quick reminder that the recording of this webinar will be available on our webinar page very soon. And if you would like to keep up to date with our latest work in general, I invite you to have a look at our Twitter page, which is @OECD EduSkills. That's basically where we put all the latest updates of our research, so you can have a look at that. But yes, big thanks to everybody again, and I hope to see you all at the next webinar.